People say grief softens with time, like water smoothing stone. But some kinds of grief don't fade, they calcify. They sit under your skin, forming a second skeleton you carry through life. That's what I thought I had with Michael's death. Something heavy, sure, but settled. Filed away in a safe, locked drawer labeled accident, and nothing more could have been done. It had been 20 years. 20 years since the funeral, the endless casseroles, the tight smiles from people too afraid to ask what really happened. 20 years of letting my parents control the narrative. 20 years of believing them. I hadn't expected to find anything that day. I wasn't even looking. I was just cleaning out the attic after our mother's funeral, sorting through her meticulously preserved artifacts like someone piecing together a museum exhibit of a life too neatly archived. Receipts, yearbooks, hand-labeled photo albums, all so carefully curated it was unnerving. That's when I saw it. Wedged inside Michael's high school yearbook, barely visible between two stiff, laminated pages, was an envelope. Old. Yellowed. Its paper thinned by time. Taped shut with a brittle strip, and on the front, in handwriting that stopped me cold, one word, my name. No date. No return address. Just Emily. Like it had been waiting for me. Like it knew I'd come eventually. I sat on the floor and opened it, the attic air suddenly thick with something I couldn't name. The letter inside was brief. Just a page. And with each line I read, the floor seemed to tilt a little further. Michael wasn't writing to say goodbye to the world. He was writing to me. And he wasn't just saying he was done. He was saying I had played a role in why. He didn't name specifics. He didn't have to. He spoke in implication and accusation, and worst of all, in certainty. He believed I had known. He believed I had seen. And he believed that I had stayed silent, even when I could have said something that might have saved him. It wasn't rage he was writing with. It was disappointment. And that hurt more. He said he hoped I remembered. And that if I didn't, that maybe forgetting was the most damning thing of all. My chest tightened as I tried to reconcile the memory of that night. The official story burned into me like gospel. Black ice, late curve, no foul play. Everyone said it was an accident. The police, my parents, the neighbors. Everyone. So why did this feel like proof of something else? Not just death. A decision. I sat there in the attic, surrounded by boxes of old lies, clutching this thin piece of paper like it might burn through my hands. I felt cold. Not the kind of cold you get from a drafty room, but the kind that settles inside you when you realize a door you thought was closed was never really shut. Michael's letter hadn't just reopened a wound. It split open a part of me I didn't even know was still bleeding. Because if he was right, if I had forgotten something, then what else had I buried to survive? And what would it cost to remember? After the attic, I didn't go home. I drove to the edge of town instead, parked near the old train tracks where Michael and I used to leave coins for the freight trains to flatten. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat behind the wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, gripping the letter in my coat pocket like a live wire. There was a weight to it that had nothing to do with paper. It was a key, but I didn't know to what yet. All I knew was that something inside me had begun to stir, a small, sharp sensation, like touching something half-forgotten in the dark and realizing it was alive. The story of Michael's death had always come with a preface. It was cold that night. He was coming back from a party. There was black ice on Route 18. No skid marks, just the wreckage wrapped around a tree. The police said it was instantaneous. My parents told me not to look at the body. So I didn't. I believed what they told me because it was easier. Cleaner. A tragedy, yes, but a random one. Not anyone's fault. A storm, not a sin. But now I couldn't stop replaying the funeral in my head. My mother's tight-lipped silence. My father's sudden obsession with gardening. The way they had scrubbed any trace of conflict from our family's history, as though grief required purity. I remember asking if we should hold some kind of memorial. Something personal. A letter, maybe. A story. But my mother shook her head sharply, like I had suggested a seance. We mourn quietly in this family, she said. And that was that. I was 17 when he died. Just old enough to be expected to hold it together. Old enough to be useful. I handled the casseroles. Answered the door. Smiled at teachers and priests and neighbors who avoided eye contact when they offered condolences. I wore a black dress I didn't like and delivered a rehearsed memory of my brother during the service. How he used to draw cartoons on his math homework. How he made me a grilled cheese with a smiley face once when I had the flu. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say, was that things had been off with Michael for a while. He'd gotten quiet that year. Not just moody teenager quiet, but glassy-eyed, slow to speak, quiet. He stopped playing guitar. He stopped eating dinner with us. He stayed up all night sometimes, pacing in the basement. Once, I woke up and found him sitting in the hallway outside my bedroom, knees to his chest, staring at the wall like he was trying to disappear into it. When I asked him if he was okay, he just said, "I'm fine. Just thinking." Thinking became the family code word. It covered everything. Michael wasn't withdrawn. He was just thinking. He wasn't skipping meals. He was thinking. He wasn't falling apart. He was deep, emotional, complex, sensitive like Dad, thoughtful like Mom. That's what we told ourselves. That's what we told everyone else. But there was one night I hadn't thought about in years. And now, the memory clawed its way back to me, piece by piece, like something surfacing from black water. It was late October. I'd come home from a friend's house earlier than expected. The lights were off when I walked in, except for a glow coming from the den. Michael was inside. I heard voices, my father's and his. Not shouting, whispering, urgent, heated. I don't remember what they said exactly. I only remember the feel of it. The tension in the air, like someone had struck a tuning fork and let it vibrate through the walls. I remember my name being said. I remember my mother's voice later, saying everything was fine, that they were just talking, and I didn't need to concern myself. I remember how tired Michael looked the next day, and how he wouldn't meet my eyes. That was 2 weeks before he died. Now I wonder if the letter wasn't just a message, it was a clock. A way to rewind time until the moments I'd blurred out came back into focus. The thing about growing up in a family like mine is that you get very good at narrative. You learn which stories are safe to tell. You learn to fill in the blanks with pretty language and harmless anecdotes. You become a curator of normalcy. I had always believed I was doing my part to keep us stitched together. But what if all I'd been doing was helping bury something alive? And if that's true, if I had seen something, heard something, sensed something, and done nothing, then what did that make me? A victim? A coward? A bystander? Or just the one who survived? After the letter, I didn't go back to the attic. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I found myself obsessively rereading the yearbook page the letter had been tucked into. It was a photo of Michael at a pep rally, mid-laugh, confetti falling over him like snow. Someone had scrawled, "You're gonna change the world," in blue ink above his head. I couldn't tell if it was irony or prophecy. There was something unbearable about that image now. The performance of happiness. The way it froze him in time, forever young, forever unbroken. But Michael had been breaking. Quietly. Incrementally. And I had been there. Now, the question I couldn't shake was, why me? Why address the letter to me? Why not Mom or Dad? Unless I'd known something. Unless I'd been the only one who could have stopped it. And if that's true, why couldn't I remember what it was? It started with a single photograph. Not the one from the yearbook, but an old Polaroid I found in a mislabeled shoebox while searching through my own storage the next week. I hadn't intended to keep digging. I told myself I'd let it rest, give it time. But something in me had shifted. Like once the memory had been disturbed, it couldn't be returned to its resting place. The photo was innocent at first glance. A backyard birthday party. Balloons sagging in the heat. Paper plates stacked beside a cooler. Michael, turning 14. And in the corner of the frame, partially obscured by a shrub, was my father. His expression was unreadable. Not smiling, not scowling. Just watching. Not the party, not the camera. Watching Michael. I stared at it for a long time. Something about it felt off, but not in any one specific way. More like the way a melody sounds wrong when a single note is out of key. My hand trembled slightly as I flipped the photo over. My mother's cursive on the back, M's last happy birthday. He was never the same after that. I sat down. Hard. It felt like my legs didn't belong to me anymore. That line, never the same, it rang like a bell. Because it was the phrase she had used about other things, too. Things we weren't supposed to question. When a neighbor's daughter stopped coming around. When a family friend vanished from holiday dinners. They changed. Things happen. People move on. And just like that, I began to remember something else. That same year, Michael had stopped going to piano lessons. My parents told me his teacher moved. That's what I believed for years. But now I remembered seeing a note once, half shredded in the trash. The teacher had written something about boundaries and inappropriate behavior at home, and not feeling comfortable continuing. At the time, I had no idea what it meant. I wasn't even sure it was about Michael. I asked my mother. She shut the bin, calmly, and said, "Some people are dramatic. It's nothing." But now? Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop replaying Michael's voice in that letter, his certainty that I'd known. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd buried those moments because I was too young to understand them, and later, too afraid to look back and see what they really were. The next morning, I visited our old neighborhood. The street looked smaller than I remembered. The trees younger. Everything sun-bleached and a little shriveled. I stood in front of the house we grew up in, now someone else's, and tried to remember how it felt to be 10, 11, 12 years old, living inside those walls, trusting them. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about what it had contained and what it hadn't. That evening, I called my Aunt Rena. She'd been the only one in our extended family to question anything at the time. I remembered her pulling me aside after the funeral, eyes red, voice shaky. She had asked if I needed to talk. I said no. She never brought it up again. Now, after the briefest of pleasantries, I said her name plainly. Rena, did you ever think Michael's death wasn't an accident? Silence. A crackle on the line. Then a slow exhale. I always thought, she said finally, that there was more to the story. But I also knew your parents. And I knew what it would cost to press too hard. What does that mean? It means your mother was determined to keep things neat. She didn't tolerate messy grief. Or messy truths. She believed in pruning. Everything. People, stories, emotions. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like her. There was a counselor, Rena added. Someone Michael saw for a few months. Your parents pulled him out after she reported concerning disclosures. That's the phrase she used. I only found out because the woman called me after being stonewalled. She was scared. Said Michael wasn't safe. I felt like the floor was tipping again. And you didn't tell me? You were a child, Emily. And your parents made it clear they'd cut me off completely if I caused confusion. I was afraid I'd lose access to you too. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't crack my voice in half. Rena sighed. I'm sorry. I should have done more. But I truly thought, there was still time. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the dark and stared at the letter again. I could almost hear Michael's voice behind the words now. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just tired. He'd been trying to leave breadcrumbs. And we had swept them away. I didn't speak to my parents for a week. Not out of anger. Not even out of fear. But because I didn't know how to hold a conversation with people I no longer recognized. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. Maybe I was finally seeing them without the scaffolding of childhood affection. It's a strange thing to realize you were raised in a carefully curated fiction. Stranger still when you participated in the set design. I kept replaying all the moments I'd rewritten over the years, the quiet dinners, the closed doors, the way my father's hands would tremble when Michael entered the room. I used to think it was grief. Or worry. But now I wasn't so sure. And that terrified me. There was a part of me that still wanted to believe the story we were given. The tragic accident. The moody teenager. The family that did its best. It was cleaner. Easier to live inside. But the letter refused to let me. I read it again. And again. And again. Until the words blurred and bled together, and my hands trembled with something I could only call dread. Not fear of the past, but fear of what I might become if I chose not to look at it. There was a particular line I couldn't stop circling. I thought you saw me. Maybe you did. Maybe you just looked away. I want to believe you didn't know. But you were always the one who listened, Emily. And I needed you to listen. That line split me open. Because he was right. I was the one who listened. To everyone. I was the emotional sponge of the family. The translator of silences. The one who smoothed things over and kept the peace. That's what my mother praised me for, my calm, my sensitivity, my understanding. But understanding is a double-edged thing, isn't it? Sometimes it means grace. And sometimes it means complicity. I remembered the night Michael sat outside my door. I had forgotten it for years, buried it, perhaps, but now it returned with painful clarity. He had knocked first. Softly. I hadn't answered. I'd been tired, irritable, halfway through a book. I thought he wanted to borrow something or maybe just talk. But I didn't want to talk. I wanted quiet. So I pretended to be asleep. And when I opened the door an hour later, I found him sitting there, curled up like a child, his back to me. I didn't say anything. Just closed the door again and went to bed. That was the last night I saw him alive. I could feel the timeline collapsing inside me. All the small omissions, the silent moments, the near confessions I hadn't known to recognize. The look in his eyes at dinner. The bruises he didn't explain. The way he flinched sometimes when our father raised his voice, not in rage, but in assertion. Authority. And then the garden. My father had started it the day after Michael's funeral. Just went out to the backyard and started digging. No planning. No blueprints. Just relentless, quiet labor. My mother brought him lemonade and cold towels like it was all perfectly normal. I never thought much of it then. Grief is weird. People cope however they can. But now I wondered what he was burying. Not literally, though the thought chilled me, but metaphorically. Emotionally. What guilt was he trying to smother under soil and roses? And why hadn't I asked? Why did none of us ask? The answer, of course, was simple. Asking meant knowing. And knowing meant responsibility. I don't know what scared me more, that my parents had known something and chosen silence, or that I had known just enough and chosen the same. The hardest truth to swallow wasn't that Michael had suffered. It was that I had been there, and I had left him alone in it. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. Just conveniently. And that's the thing about trauma that nobody tells you. Sometimes it isn't a hurricane. Sometimes it's a slow leak in the ceiling. A draft in the walls. Something that weakens the foundation while you decorate the living room and plan birthday parties. Sometimes you only realize you were drowning when you finally come up for air and find no one waiting on the shore. She returned to the house not with rage, but with resolve. It wasn't about vengeance or uncovering some buried confession. It was about breaking the spell. The one that had bound their family in a web of half-truths and omissions for decades. The living room looked unchanged, frozen in time, as if it had been hermetically sealed from grief. Polished hardwood floors, white curtains undisturbed by wind, picture frames curated like museum exhibits. Her father sat in his usual spot, eyes moving across a newspaper with mechanical rhythm. Her mother, always attentive to rituals, offered tea without inquiry. She placed the letter on the coffee table between them. The paper was yellowed, slightly creased, trembling with more than age. Her parents registered it not with curiosity, but apprehension. A recognition of something dangerous, not because of what it was, but because of what it would unearth. Her mother's glance was sharp and fleeting. Her father didn't look at the letter at all. Instead, his gaze shifted past it, as if acknowledging it would pull something out of him he couldn't or wouldn't face. The letter wasn't news. That much was immediately clear. It wasn't that they didn't remember. It was that they had actively tried to forget. Her mother's posture stiffened, as though bracing for a storm that had always been on the horizon but never named aloud. Her father remained still, holding tension in his jaw, a quiet resistance to the unspooling of a narrative they had buried so deliberately. There was no denial, no confusion, only the weight of something long repressed settling across the room like fog. What struck her wasn't their guilt, it was their choreography. The practiced calm. The way her mother glanced toward the garden, the way her father folded the newspaper just so, as if any slight disruption to their routine might rupture the walls holding back the past. They had built a life on managed appearances. Emotional containment masquerading as strength. Grief was cataloged and stored, not felt. Pain was sculpted into productivity. Even their remembrance of Michael had been diluted, softened until it resembled nostalgia more than mourning. She realized then, her parents had rewritten history not because they didn't care, but because caring openly would have shattered them. And so they painted over the cracks, covered wounds with wallpaper, erased the boy who didn't fit into their picture of survival. The silence between them became a language of its own. They spoke through avoidance, through curated memories, through roses in the backyard that bloomed too perfectly, too obediently. She watched her father step outside into the garden, hands folded behind his back, staring into the sculpted order of his creation. The garden had never been for Michael. It had been a monument to forgetfulness, a space to bury not just grief, but accountability. Her mother remained seated, eyes distant, not cold, just unreachable. There would be no apology, no unraveling of the lie, only the quiet acknowledgement that they had chosen this silence and lived in it for 20 years. What haunted her wasn't what they said. It was what they refused to say, what they had rehearsed not speaking about, what they had built an entire life around not confronting. She didn't need them to confess. She didn't even need them to understand. She just needed to stop carrying the weight of their omission. For the first time in her adult life, she saw her parents clearly, not as villains, but as architects of a fragile world built on survival and denial. They had chosen preservation over truth, safety over pain, and in doing so, they had lost a son, and she had lost a brother. But now, at least, she had the truth, even if it came without resolution, even if it came alone. The truth hadn't set her free, not in the way she imagined. There was no grand release, no cathartic moment of clarity that cleared the air and put everything in its place. The truth, as it turned out, didn't come with neatly tied ribbons or easy resolutions. It simply stood there, heavy and unyielding, a presence in the room that couldn't be ignored. The garden bloomed, as it always did, indifferent to the quiet unraveling inside the house. Her father continued to tend to it, as though the earth could be coaxed into forgiving the things that had been left unsaid. Her mother, too, returned to her routines, polishing the silver, folding the laundry, keeping the house pristine. As if the days continued in their neat pattern, unaffected by the weight of the past. But the silence between them had changed. The easy dance of avoidance was no longer comfortable. There were no accusations, no bitter words. Just an unspoken understanding that something essential had been revealed, and nothing would be quite the same again. She didn't expect an apology. She didn't need one. What was lost could never be returned. What had been buried was too deep to excavate. But what she had gained, in the quiet aftermath, was a deeper understanding of herself and of the family that had shaped her. Her relationship with her parents didn't heal overnight. It wasn't as though the truth had fixed anything, but it had cracked the surface of their lives, revealing the complex fractures beneath. And with that crack, there was a possibility of something new, something more honest. Her own healing, too, began to shift. Not in grand gestures or breakthroughs, but in small, subtle ways. She stopped holding the weight of the past so tightly. She began to loosen her grip on the stories she had been told, the narratives she had constructed for herself. She no longer needed to bury Michael's memory in the name of family peace. She could hold it, fragile and broken, and let it be what it was: complex, painful, but real. It wasn't forgiveness that she needed. It was release. The release to let the past be the past, to stop carrying the burden of what could never be fixed, and to stop living in the shadow of a story that was never hers to tell. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the evening light filtered through the blinds, she allowed herself to feel the grief. Not the grief of loss, it was too late for that, but the grief of the things that had never been said. The grief of a life that could have been different, but wasn't. She wasn't angry. She wasn't resentful. Just tired. Tired of the weight of a family history that had tried too hard to be perfect. Tired of the stories they had told themselves to avoid looking at the pain that was right in front of them. And in that tiredness, there was peace. A quiet, tentative peace. It wasn't closure. It wasn't resolution. But it was enough. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't rewrite the story of Michael's life, or her own. But she could choose to live in the truth. Not to fix it, not to erase the pain, but to simply acknowledge it. To stop pretending that the things that had been buried didn't matter. And so, she moved forward. Slowly, cautiously, but with the knowledge that she no longer had to carry the burden of a family silence. She could look at the past, not as something to be ashamed of or hidden, but as something to learn from. A lesson in the cost of silence. A lesson in the weight of unspoken words. The roses in the garden continued to bloom. Unbothered. Untouched. Just as they had always been. But for the first time, she saw them for what they were, not a symbol of preservation, but a quiet testament to the things that lived beneath the surface, hidden from view. And in that quiet understanding, she found the room to breathe. Weeks passed. The house remained the same, pristine, untouched, but the air between them had shifted, subtly and irreparably. Her parents still lived in their cocoon of well-practiced normalcy, but she no longer played along. The truth, though unspoken between them, had found its place in her heart. She no longer needed to ask them for answers. The silence, as heavy as it was, had given her the one thing she had been seeking: clarity. She didn't return to confront them again. There was no need. The question of forgiveness had already been answered in the quiet space between them, the one where truth didn't need to be spoken aloud. She had learned to live with it, to honor Michael's memory without their approval, to let the past remain, not as a weight to carry, but as a part of her that had shaped who she was becoming. And so, she moved forward, not with resentment or anger, but with the acceptance that some things, some people, are beyond repair. But even in that brokenness, there was freedom. The freedom to let go, to stop carrying what was never hers to fix, to simply be.